It's on. Okay, good afternoon, class. My topic is over the controversial issue of hypersexuality disorder, and that is what we're going to be discussing today. But first, I want to talk about how it relates to Griggs text. The topic of hypersexuality relates to the Griggs text, Chapter 2, over neuroscience. Chapter 2 focuses on specific brain activity and neurotransmitters that impact our everyday emotions, perception, and instincts. In Chapter 2, you will find the neurotransmitter dopamine, which has a major influence on a person's perception of pleasure and access to the brain's reward system. Hypersexuality abuses the advantages of dopamine, causing chronic behavior, which is one of the leading reasons why many psychologists have proposed it to the DSM-5 in the first place. Hypersexuality defined. Hypersexuality, or sexual addiction, is defined as a dysfunctional preoccupation with sexual desire or behavior at levels high enough to be considered clinically significant. Hypersexuality commonly involves symptoms of excessive pornography watching, compulsive masturbation, and a new addition to hypersexuality known as objectified partner sex, which I found very interesting. It's basically when the victim of hypersexuality treats their sex partner like an object with no feelings or perception. Sexual addiction can be viewed as an adaptive attempt to regulate mood and tolerate and tolerate stressors through the abuse of intensely stimulating sexual fantasy and behavior. It is believed that sexual addiction is a dysfunctional adult response to innate personality, character, emotional regulatory deficits, as well as reaction to early attachment disorders, abuse, and trauma. Hypersexuality's intro to the DSM. The DSM is the leading source of organizing a standard criteria for the classification of mental disorders. The DSM notes that in order for a particular behavior to be classified as a disorder, it must exhibit patterns that are chronic and pervasive in nature. So basically, it has to deal with chronic behavior that affects your school, working environment, social interactions, or relationships, such things of that nature. Okay. Okay. Hypersexuality's causes according to Carnes and Court. Carnes' approach to sexual addiction often involves the confessions of people, their sexual habits, and experiences. And contrary to Love, helping the sexual addict, which is one of Carnes' most renowned novels, explains how some people are vulnerable to sexual addiction than others, given their sexual experiences as a child, typically involving some form of sexual abuse. Carnes supports this claim with what he calls the 4-step cycle to addiction. The cycle of addiction begins with something known as preoccupation, which is a phase within the addiction cycle which involves a person concluding that they will not, engage in risky sexual behavior again. They're kind of like, oh, well, just this one time, I'm going through a lot, I'm not going to, do this again. The second step is ritualization, which is the phase where numerous sexual episodes happen more frequently and are affecting one or more aspects of a person's life, but are justified internally rather than externally through a person's insecurities or issues with sexual identity. The third step is compulsive sexual behavior, which is the more intense step, which involves the frequent sexual behavior, which begins to have a negative impact on several aspects of a person's life, where the person usually no longer feels the need to justify their actions and continues to engage in risky sexual behavior. Now, despair is the last step, where the person actually is basically trying to move toward finding help for their sexual addiction, although they end up falling into a relapse and just basically going to despair. So it's kind of like a back and forth type thing, seeking help and having a relapse. And then basically the cycle starts all over again. Okay. In correlation to Carnes' view on hypersexuality, Core closely focuses on the person's brain activity as a way of provoking the hypersexual nature. So Carnes was more so based on witnesses and them talking about their experiences. You can compare Carnes to like a Dr. Phil, where Core is more focused on the scientific aspects of the disorder. So Core closely focuses on the person's brain activity as a way of provoking the hypersexual nature. Relative to Carnes' claims, Core explains how adolescent sexual abuse can lead to hypersexuality when the bilateral lesions in the limbic region of the brain cause people to blend logical and subjective thinking together. So basically you have two sides of the brain. You have, basically in a nutshell, to simplify it, you have your logical side and you have your subjective side. And when people are victims of hypersexuality, those sides kind of like blend together, so it's almost like they're turning fact into fiction, and basically means they're delusional. Core also mentions the activity of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is a principal neurochemical that activates your reward system, the centerpiece of the limbic system. Your reward system drives nearly all of your behaviors. When excess dopamine is activated, the sex drive can become overwhelming and sexual urges can become intolerable. So here, moving on, we have the limbic system, which is maybe a little difficult to see, but it's like in the lower region of the brain. And the limbic system consists of several parts, although the hypothalamus has the most influence in the hypersexual victims. The hypothalamus is responsible for regulating hunger, pain perception, aggression, and arousal. When there is overactivity happening within the hypothalamus, it can stress the nerves within this region of the brain, leading to a significant decrease in activity, causing sexual satisfaction to be harder to achieve. This usually results in the hypersexual patient often having the intolerable urge to have sex numerous times until they reach satisfaction. So that's like basically one of the best explanations of this disorder. I was going to play a video, but I'm pressed for time, so I'm going to skip past. So what's next? In order for the official diagnosis of sexual addiction to be made, professionals must first rule out concurrent drug abuse as well as those major mental health disorders that also include hypersexuality as a symptom. Examples of these include bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and adult attention deficit disorder, all of which have hypersexual or impulsive sexual behavior as a potential symptom. Some individuals may have both a major mental disorder and sexual addiction, both of which need to be addressed, much as one might be both alcoholic and bipolar. Until the diagnosis of hypersexuality is perfected, skeptics like Martin Levine and Richard Troyden, whom are both also psychologists, will continue to doubt hypersexuality's relevance. Okay. So now I'm going to introduce the no side. Challenging hypersexuality's relevance. Psychologists Martin Levine, Richard Troyden, David Lee, and Lonnie Myers all see a series of flaws in the proposal of hypersexuality to the DSM. So basically, Levine and Troyden implied that hypersexuality is a result of mood disorders like bipolar disorder and other anxiety disorders like I just recently mentioned. They also concluded that the highly frequent sexual episodes were only temporary rather than long-term, like an actual addiction. They emphasized how when a person's emotional mood is excessive, or they experience mania, it can lead to those overwhelming sexual urges, recurring quite often than usual, but not to be seen as a sexual addiction, but more so understanding that it's an abnormal mood state. And for Lee focused more on the idea of hypersexuality having no correlation to an actual addiction because it doesn't consist of the same brain activity that typically provokes addiction, whether it be drugs or alcohol. He also notes that a behavior disorder cannot be classified as an addiction like drugs and alcohol, but rather nothing more than a disorder in general. And one of the most interesting perspectives I found was Lonnie Myers. He views hypersexuality as a behavioral disorder as well, being strongly related to poor development and personality traits. Myers mentioned Sigmund Freud's concept known as the reality principle, where a person finds gratification for instinctual drives like sex within the standard constraints of society. But he explains how when people go beyond these standards of reality, principle due to consistent and excessive sexual behavior, it is not a form of addiction, but rather a lack of moral values and a person's poor quality traits implanted within their behavior and personality, like vulnerability and obsession. But I forgot to add, basically Myers' perception of hypersexuality, he basically views it as like an excuse for people, you know, like basically trying to justify people that have sex a lot. Like, he feels like the introduction of hypersexuality to the DSM is a joke because he feels like a lot of people are just using that as an excuse to justify their lack of moral values, having sex with a lot of people, and things of that nature. Taking sides. As a result of all the research I have conducted, I do find it hard to pick a side. Although now that I have a better understanding of what hypersexuality is and what it consists of, I feel as though hypersexuality as an actual addiction needs to be more widely supported and more studies and data to sway me to agree with the technicalities of the disorder. After taking note of Myers' view on hypersexuality being within a person's personality traits due to things like vulnerability, I have come to agree with the idea of hypersexuality almost being a way to justify morally unacceptable sexual behavior. This is a controversial issue that will probably never be agreed on between differing psychologists, although I do believe the no side currently has no credibility. And that is all.